In this video, I'm going to be discussing what's so special about famous Burgundy wine producer Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, or DRC, which many regard to be the best wine in the entire world. We're going to be discussing why this wine costs so much, with prices ranging anywhere from around $3,000 a bottle for some of their least expensive wines to as much as a brand new Toyota Camry for their top wine. Be sure to stick around to the end of this video because I'll be explaining how I've been able to try DRC wines 10 to 12 times or so, despite the fact that I've never purchased an entire bottle myself. While DRC, the winery, was not established until 1869, one of its vineyards traces its history all the way back to the 1200s. This was the time when it was acquired by the Abbey of Saint-Vivant and managed by the monks for a number of years. Centuries later, this famous vineyard, which was known as Romanée, was the subject of a bidding war between Louis XV's mistress and her nemesis, the Prince of Conti. The well-heeled Prince of Conti was successful in this bidding war and enjoyed the spoils by, among other things, renaming this famous vineyard Romanee-Conti. This victory was short-lived, however, as during the French Revolution, this vineyard was seized and auctioned off. Ultimately, the Romanée-Conti vineyard was acquired by DRC's founders, Jacques-Marie Duval and Sophie Blockhe, and the owners of DRC subsequently added a number of additional prestigious Grand Cru Burgundy vineyards to their holdings. One of the reasons that Domaine de la Romanée-Conti's wines are so special is because they have some of the very best vineyard holdings, not just in Burgundy, but in the entire world. In fact, DRC's wines are produced exclusively from fruit from Grand Cru vineyards. And keep in mind that Grand Cru vineyards represent less than 1% of the surface area in Burgundy and produce less than 1% of the Burgundy wine that's produced. So you're talking about the best of the best. But even though Grand Cru vineyards make up the top 1% of all vineyard holdings in Burgundy, the DRC vineyards stand out, and two of them are at the very top of the quality pyramid in Burgundy. One of these vineyards is the aforementioned La Romanée-Conti, and the other is Latos. Significantly, both La Romanée-Conti and Latos are monopoles. And if the term monopole sounds like monopoly, that's accurate, as a monopole means that you have a designated wine-growing region that's controlled by a single producer. So this means that DRC is the only producer that can make wine from what is undoubtedly the two best vineyard sources in all of Burgundy and probably in the entire world. In addition to the two monopoles, DRC also owns parcels in 5 other top Grand Crus, and in fact, their parcels are probably some of the most desirable in each of these Grand Crus as well. Namely, Montrachet, which is a region that produces some of the best Chardonnay in the entire world, Richebourg, Romanée-Saint-Vivant, Grand Czo Ezo, and Ezo. In addition, DRC also sources fruit from 2 other Grand Crus, namely Corton and Corton Charlemagne. While DRC's vineyard holdings are so special that they would undoubtedly produce world-class wines even with mediocre winemaking, DRC's meticulous approach in the vineyard and in the winery further enhances this high-quality fruit and makes wines that are absolutely sublime and have to be tasted to be believed. In the vineyard, the 2 most significant aspects to DRC's philosophy are biodynamics and low yields. With respect to biodynamic farming, DRC had experimented with biodynamic practices for a number of years, but finally went all in 2007. And so now all their vineyards are farmed biodynamically. Among other things, that means that they use organic farming techniques so they don't add any synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. They also make heavy use of compost to enrich the soil, and they use various biodynamic preparations to spray on the vines, among other things. DRC's vines average an impressive 40 years and produce fairly low volumes anyway, especially because of their high-density planting techniques in the vineyard. But during each growing season, DRC further ensures low production through a number of techniques, including aggressive pruning early in the growing season, doing a green harvest or dropping fruit during the growing season, and then a very strict selection of fruit at harvest. Incredibly, for these reasons, it takes the fruit from 3 grapevines on average to produce a single bottle of DRC. The result is intensely concentrated fruit that's extremely well balanced and has incredible aging potential. In the winery, DRC's approach is characterized by minimal intervention. They do use whole bunch fermentation in varying percentages depending on the vintage. They use natural or ambient yeast, gentle extraction techniques, and they mature the wines in new French oak. So what do the DRC wines taste like? A little bit later in this episode, I'll go through each of the wines that DRC produces and give some of my thoughts regarding those wines in context. But suffice it to say, it's always a special, memorable occasion to taste a DRC wine, and they can be absolutely mind-blowing experiences. This is particularly true with wines from the 2 monopoles, Romanée-Conti and Latos. In fact, DRC wines are probably responsible for my 3 top red wine drinking experiences, and probably even my 3 top overall wine experiences. While mere words will never do DRC justice, in all the times that I've tasted DRC, what stands out is the fact that it's what I describe as intensely ethereal. I know this sounds oxymoronic, but what I mean by that is when you first taste the wine, the first thing you experience is elegance and finesse. But soon, you realize that the wine just continues to expand in intensity, power, and concentration, and completely overwhelm your senses. In other words, there's just an unbelievable intensity and concentration that belies the body weight for the wine, and which is downright confusing the first couple times you try it. The other thing that stands out, and which characterizes a world-class wine, is an extremely long finish and also the presence of numerous discrete descriptors. When you have a wine of marginal quality, you may have something like just muddled red fruit, and you can't really identify particular types of red fruit, and there may not be any other descriptors of note either. But with DRC, there's numerous discrete descriptors that are readily identifiable. So why are Domaine de la Romanée-Conti wines so expensive? Well, there's several reasons. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. So why is DRC so expensive? Well, ultimately, as you learned in economics class, this is a situation where the price is largely dictated by the law of supply and demand. There's incredible demand for DRC, as it's unquestionably one of the very best wines in the entire world, and so those who can afford it and who are passionate about wine definitely want to buy this wine and buy multiple bottles of it if they can. Unfortunately, however, even though DRC has a number of different bottlings that they produce, and which we'll discuss in a moment, they just don't make that much wine. Only around 6,000 to 8,000 cases in total annual production. And for their top wine, the DRC romanee-conti, they only produce between 300 and 600 cases annually. So that one is especially difficult to locate. But compare this to a top Bordeaux producer like Lafite Rothschild. Lafite produces around 35 to 40,000 cases of annual production, and they make about 15 to 20,000 cases annually of their top wine. With that by way of background, I'll quickly run through each of the different wines that DRC produces. They produce both red wines and white wines. In all, they have 10 different bottlings, although one of them is not sold commercially, and not all of them are produced every vintage. We're going to start with the DRC red wines, and there's 7 of them. We'll start with the best of the best, namely the DRC Romanée-Conti monopole. The DRC holdings in Romanée-Conti span 1.8 hectares, but their production volume can vary wildly from vintage to vintage due to problems that Burgundy has experienced with issues such as late frosts and hailstorms and the like. So from the time period 2009 through 2019, production volume for the Romanée-Conti bottling has varied from as low as 3,900 bottles to as much as around 7,900 bottles. This is a wine that will set you back around $25,000 if you get an allocation for the 2021 bottling. I was fortunate to try this wine once as part of a horizontal tasting of DRC that included the 1990 Romanée-Conti, the 1990 Richebourg, the 1990 Latos, and the 1990 Czo Ezo. And this wine outclassed all of them. This is definitely the best wine that I've ever tasted, and it's not really even close. The Latos, which I'll discuss next, was second. DRC has much larger holdings in the Latos monopole than the Romanée-Conti monopole, specifically around 6 hectares or so. As such, they typically produce much more Latos than they do Romanée-Conti. As you might suspect, this results in much lower pricing, so Latos will set you back around $7,000 for the 2021 release. In terms of taste, Latos can be more robust than the Romanée-Conti. It can have some structured tannins that benefit from some additional bottle aging before you enjoy it. It has impressive depth and quality, but it tends to be a little bit more subtle than the Richebourg. Richebourg is located right next to the Romanée-Conti monopole. DRC has around 3.5 hectares of vineyards in Richebourg. Between 2009 and 2019, DRC's annual production of Richebourg ranged anywhere from as little as 6,000 bottles a year to around 15,000 bottles a year. So again, the production can vary quite dramatically. This is a rich, voluptuous, intense wine that's extremely aromatic, a very enjoyable wine. I did some searching on Wine Searcher and found a few places selling the 2020 vintage for around $3,600 or $3,700 per bottle. DRC also makes a red wine from Pinot Noir in Romanée-Saint-Vivant. They have around 5¼ hectares of vineyards in this Grand Cru appellation. Their annual production ranged from a low of around 10,000 bottles to a high of about 21,000 bottles between 2009 and 2019. This is a wine that's a little bit more delicate and silky with some minerality. On Wine Searcher, I was able to find this wine for the 2020 vintage, selling for a little bit less than $3,000 per bottle. The next 2 DRC red wines come from Grand Cru appellations called Grand Czo and Czo. These both tend to be a little bit more rustic than the wines that I've discussed previously, although the Grand Czo is a little bit more light and delicate than the Czo. Both are extremely impressive wines, however, and it's always a treat to taste either one of them. The Grand Czo will set you back around $3,000 per bottle for the 2020 vintage, and the 2020 Czo will sell for about 10% less than that. So far, all the red wines that I've discussed that were produced by DRC are from their own estate vineyards, but in late 2008, they also secured a lease on some vineyards in the Corton Grand Cru AOC. Corton is located in the Côte de Beaune. The Côte de Beaune is most well known for the production of white wine from Chardonnay, and so this wine tends to be quite different from the other red wines that we've discussed so far. This wine can be very firm and structured and definitely requires some substantial bottle aging before it shows its best. I did a search on Wine Searcher and found the 2020 vintage selling for between $2,500 and $2,900 per bottle. In certain vintages, DRC will also produce a wine from Vosne Romanée that they classify as a Premier Cru and which is named after their founders. Specifically, this wine is called the Kuve Duval Blockhe. When it is produced, this wine is produced from some of the younger vines from the Grand Cru vineyards in Czo, Grand Czo, Romanée-Saint-Vivant, and Richebourg. This is a wine that could be purchased for as little as $500 to $700 10 to 12 years ago in the United States, but now it typically will run you at least $2,500 a bottle on release. This is an extremely enjoyable wine, although it's not at the same level of the Grand Cru bottlings. It reminds me a bit of the Czo, but with more prominent, less polished tannins. DRC also produces 3 Grand Cru white wines. One of them, however, is not sold commercially. That is the Batar Montret. They produce this one in quantities of about 50 cases per year, and they just keep this one at the estate to enjoy with friends. The DRC Montret is sold commercially, but it's extremely difficult to find this one and when you do find it, it's extremely expensive. I saw current releases selling for around $10,000 per bottle and up. This one is produced in very low quantities, and sometimes as little as 1,000 bottles per vintage, and other times probably no more than 4,000 bottles or so. This is a wine that's still on my bucket list and I haven't tried yet, so I don't have any personal insights into how it tastes, but it's reportedly one of the best, highest quality, most age-worthy expressions of Chardonnay in the entire world. Before I discuss my thoughts regarding buying DRC wines and how I'm able to taste them without buying bottles in full myself, there's one last white wine that DRC produces, and this is from Corton, Charlemagne. In 2018, DRC first began leasing some vineyards in Corton, Charlemagne. These vineyards span around 2.9 hectares and consist of 4 different parcels. There's one parcel located at the top of the slope, one parcel at the bottom of the slope, and 2 in the middle. The first wine DRC produced from Corton, Charlemagne was the 2019 vintage. Based on some searching on Wine Searcher, it looks like this wine will sell for around $8,000 per bottle. Now we're to the part of the video where I discuss my thoughts regarding buying or tasting opportunities for DRC wines. Of course, when it comes to buying the wine, you have to use extreme caution, as this is one of the most counterfeited wines in the entire world, and even the DRC website has an extensive discussion about some precautions that they recommend to help ensure that you don't buy counterfeit wines. The other thing to note is that the vintage volumes vary substantially from vintage to vintage, and so the best chance to get a wine would be from a vintage that has substantial production. Fortunately, there's a vintage like that coming up in the 2022 vintage, and in that vintage, DRC said that for one of the first times in recent memory, they actually had their vats in the winery completely filled with grapes. And if you're interested in securing a bottle of DRC in the next few vintages, I would definitely keep an eye out for some 2022, since pricing may be a little bit better on that vintage due to more abundant supply. Of course, one of the most potentially traumatic experiences that someone could envision would be laying out a ton of cash to try to taste a bottle of DRC, only to have a negative experience because the bottle was flawed. Fortunately, however, the bottles I've tasted have all been quite consistent, and there's only been one occasion where the wine was anything less than absolutely phenomenal, and even in that situation, it was pretty darn good. Due to the expense of wines like DRC and to the potential downside, one of the things that I like to do to taste not just DRC, but also any expensive collectible wines, is to assemble a tasting group, and then we'll each pool our resources and purchase the wines for the tasting, or perhaps contribute from our collection bottles of relatively equal value. We'll typically have 7 to 8 people participate in these events, and that way each person is only contributing about 1/8 of the cost for the wines. That serves as a hedge against downside, but more importantly, it's also much more fun and rewarding to experience these world-class wines with friends and with people in your tasting group. It makes for a much more memorable experience, and that's really what wine is all about. It's not particularly easy to assemble a tasting group and to secure these wines, but it's well worth the effort, and I highly recommend it. In the meantime, however, if you're interested in my recommendations regarding some extremely high-quality Burgundy that can be purchased for as little as $50 per bottle, be sure to check out this video that's linked above.